This game features a brutal exchange sac. It was played between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann way back in the Charity Cup in March 22, and we have to relish these old classic gems because who knows when they'll next play each other, if ever. So Carlsen playing white kicks off with e4. e5 from Niemann. We now head down the standard opening moves of the Italian game with the bishop coming to c4. We had knight f6, pawn to d3, and the bishop now came to c5, developing outside of the pawn chain, preparing pawn to d6. Castles now from both players. Pawn h3, very standard, takes away g4. d6 was played, and now pawn c3 from Carlsen, the classic flexible move. d4 on the cards, b4 in certain positions also, but not when black plays a5, which is what Niemann now did. Clamping on the b4 square, you can go a6, very rich theoretical position. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the Italian game, there's an awesome course on sale right now on Chessable. As we're leading up to the Black Friday in November, there's some great deals out there. And if you use the code I've linked down below, also helps out myself as I grow this channel. So thanks very much for that support as well. Now on with the game here. After this move of pawn to a5, we had rook to e1 from Carlsen. Standard developing move, overprotect c4, preparing d4. Now h6 from Niemann, and now pawn to d4 from Carlsen, immediately breaking. You can maneuver here, by the way, with knight b to d2, start that whole journey with the knight to f1. You can go a4, but okay, d4 from Carlsen, very direct in this game. Now Niemann drops the bishop back. If you take that pawn, the problem is you're setting white up with the big centre, and after the bishop moves, you're also letting this knight now develop to c3. Good advantage for white. So instead the bishop drops back, keeps that central tension, and now Carlsen drops his bishop back to b3, a preemptive move because he's preparing to slide it to c2 to overprotect e4. And that's what we now see after rook to e8. Because black's threatening to take on d4 as I'm drawing on the board here, and then you'd have rook and knight converging on the e4 pawn. And by the way, you don't want to close the position here with pawn d5. This is positionally suspect because you've now blunted this bishop down that diagonal and down this diagonal. You're also kind of locking out your heavy pieces here, so it's just not a good way for white to play. And you also open up the black bishop, by the way. So that's why bishop c2, protects c4, maintains tension, and now different ways for Niemann to go. He plays very direct with pawn to d5 here. So Carlsen captures on d5. Niemann has a choice of how to recapture, and he goes with the queen. That is the best move because the knight on f6 is actually doing a good job of protecting that e4 square, a critical battleground in this position. Bishop back to b3. The queen slid back, and now knight b to d2, Carlsen continues his development, and he also looks to jump to c4, forking these two pieces. Now it looks like you're losing a pawn here, because black can take on d4, but you're actually not, because white can take here with check, then the knight recaptures, and now it's backpedaling. Now actually this is the best continuation for black. But the reason Niemann didn't do this is then knight c4 comes, the queen goes, now you pick up on b6, pawn recaptures, so your knight's on the back rank, your pawn structure's shattered, although actually it's not so easy for white to prove advantage. You could take with the pawn or the knight there. You suspect Carlsen would have taken with the pawn to keep pieces on and tension, and although white has the bishops, potential to push the pawn, black should be doing okay here. b5 can come, bishop f5, best way for black to go. But okay, Niemann rejected this one, didn't take on d4. Instead he pushed e4, looks very tempting, gaining that space, kicking the knight, but the problem is knight c4 comes, a critical in-between move, because after the queen moves, now this knight can hop to e5, and if this one captures, well, this knight is protecting the square. And actually pawn takes is best here because you kick the knight on f6 and then the pawn on e4 will be weak in the long run. So after queen to d8, knight f to e5, instead Niemann carried on developing with bishop to e6, And Carlsen's got a number of good moves here. He can already chop this bishop on b6, for example, but he carries on his development with bishop to f4, and it induces a big blunder here from Niemann. So he plants this knight on d5, but gives up the e4 pawn and just doesn't get the compensation for it. What he should actually do is take on e5. Now it's a bit miserable, he's going to be worse. This time you don't actually want to take with the pawn. After the knight jumps to d5, there is better compensation against this bishop. You should be able to save the black bishop. Won't go too deep on that. But after the bishop recaptures, white retains a good advantage here. You're going to pick up one of those bishops and stay about a pawn ahead on the evaluation. So after bishop f4, takes on e5 was best in this position. But knight d5 from Hans, and the reason this is a big mistake is now white just takes the pawn on e4, as Magnus duly did. And if you take on f4 here, then the compensation just is way insufficient, because not only are you a pawn down, but you're also going to lose one of these bishops here, so you won't even have the bishop pair in compensation. So Hans tries this pawn to f5 move to mix things up. Now we had takes on c6 from Magnus, the pawn recaptured, and this is where Magnus unleashes his brutal exchange sac. So he chops on e6, getting rid of that light squared bishop, and then planting this bishop on e5 here. Monster piece. And it can't be opposed by this dark squared bishop, because we can see how hemmed in that piece really is. So queen g5 was played, activating. Magnus goes queen f3, overprotects this f4 square from some knight jumps. Now we had rook d8 centralizing, and now Magnus simply chops on b6 here, the pawn recaptures, and we can now see he's opened up this deadly light squared bishop. c4 was played. Yes, it blocks the bishop for a moment, but actually Hans actually gives back the exchange here because he doesn't have a lot of good moves. Say you go knight to f6, very natural looking move, coming into e4. Well, now this is the problem, pawn to c5. You open that bishop, so the knight would have to come back so as not to lose the rook, but then you can take on b6. Again, the knight can't take, you lose the rook with check, and the pawn's marching very quickly, plus this bishop is converging with it on the b8 square. Big problems for black. So in this position here, after c4, Hans gives back the exchange, pawn recaptures, and he jumps into f4, desperate for counterplay around the king. Magnus goes c5 check. King h7 played, and now you could already take here with a good game, but Magnus flicks in this h4 move, really nice tactic, and it starts to force simplification, which is why it's so good as well. So the queen has to recapture because it has to keep tabs on the knight. Oh, it could go to g4 as well, but then you swap, and okay, again, the end game's very, very good. But after takes, which is what we saw, pawn g3, looks like you're losing a piece to that fork, but the knight checks, this is crucial, the king jumps up, and then queen g4. Only move because the queen was attacked, has to keep tabs with the knight, but now Magnus gets to exchange queens. Pawn recaptures, no issues with the tactics, so now he can munch on b6, and these two pawns are just an unstoppable duo. So the knight hopped back, looking to cover this square some more. Now we had e6 anyway, king g6 sought to activate, e7 hit the rook, it slid across, Magnus brings his rook behind the pawn. And now there's different ways to play, doesn't matter what you do. Hans tried this one, attacking the rook, it came to e3, then he went to d4, hitting this dangerous bishop, but Magnus simply ignores it, goes to b7 with the pawn, and Hans drops back. Nothing he can do anymore, one of these pawns is going to go through decisively. So we had rook e6 check, and here we had a resignation from Hans. Because say the king slides up to g7 here, g5 rather, so as to avoid the discovered checks on f7, well then you can simply queen the pawn. There are other good winning moves, but this is a simple way. After the rook recaptures, then this one runs through, and after the smoke clears, you're a whole rook up and only a pawn down. Clearly a one position. If you want to see the latest part in my chess cheating series to see how the story has developed, then check out the video on the left. And if you want to see the ground zero game where this all began, then check out the video on the right. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.